Now I want to call your attention to a specialty brush that does something similar to what we did on the horns, but I didn't use it because I don't feel like you have nearly the level of control, and you'll see why, but it's an interesting brush. If you press B to bring up your brush menu, press S for scales. You're going to find Scales A here. If I press that and drag it along, you can see how this creates an overlapping scale geometry. It really does pull out the geo really far though. So you got to make sure that you have a reasonable number of subdivision levels for it to actually work for you. So you can do some cool stuff here. And just by changing your alpha, you can change the type of scales that it creates. For instance, if I were to switch this over to, let's say, alpha 54, we get a scale patterning like that. And if I were to change it to, let's put something really strange in here, alpha 61, we get a pattern like that. So it's definitely worth experimenting with. You can get some really interesting, intricate patterns with this stuff. But personally, I just prefer to have an idea of what I want to sculpt and then just go in and sculpt it directly using some very simple brushes. I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed with the sheer number of brushes in ZBrush and get a little distracted with them, to be honest. So I try and just focus entirely on creating form and try and use the least number of brushes to do it, and just some simple brushes that I keep in my toolbox. And the brushes I use, again, may not be the brushes you end up using. You may find the scale brush to be a workhorse and you use it for many different things, and that's great. That's important because these brushes are so versatile. Anyone can find any number of uses for them, so it's really important that you experiment and see what you like the best, because it's just like painting. Everyone's got their own box full of paintbrushes, and they probably have a select few that they actually use. Everyone's got a ton of Photoshop brushes, but they have the ones that they actually use. And the same is true for ZBrush. You're going to have a ton of brushes here, and then you're going to have the brushes that you actually use. And it's good that they've got that number of options for you. So we're just going to do a few more little tweaks here at the end. I've just been working the forms off camera, just done a few little tweaks here and there, not too much. Now I'm just thinking about how the flesh is compressing back here at the corners of the mouth. And I'm going in with the clay tubes brush, and if you can hear the plane going by outside, I apologize for that. I live very close to the Wellington airport. So, I'm going to stroke this right through here, and there we go. I'm going to turn up the Z intensity just a bit. And I'm going to change to alpha 1. I'm going to change to the inflate brush now, and I'm just going to inflate this just a little bit just to pucker it out and smooth it back. Kind of like having that sharp line right there, but I don't want it to be sharp all the way up, so I'm going to go back in with the clay tubes brush, and I'm just going to run the clay tubes brush into that recess just to make it a little shallower so it creases there. There we go. And looking from the top view, again, notice that I do have X symmetry turned off at this point. I'm working both sides at the same time, which takes a lot of attention to detail. You have to really think about what you're doing, but it's going to give you a much better result on your finished piece because of the inherent asymmetry. I'm going to turn off that alpha. Go back to just the clay tubes brush with no alpha applied to it. And I'm just stroking between the forms very lightly. Remember that pressure sensitivity is on my brush. You enable that and set that in the Wacom control panel. can just very gently, so you can see this really harsh shadow here. I'm not liking that, so I just want to fill that in just slightly. And I'm going to build up the cheekbone again next to it, and then smooth that back. Go in with the move brush, tweak these forms just a little bit. And there we go. Oops, let's undo that, go back to the clay tubes brush. And I'm just lightly stroking between the forms. And you see what that does is, as I stroke across that line there where the cheekbone meets the temple, I'm not filling it in completely, I'm just sort of stroking over it, and it helps lose just some little areas of that shadow there. So it helps that form become more implied, as opposed to having that cheekbone perfectly defined all the way across. Don't be afraid to lose shadow in some areas. You don't want to have every form completely surrounded by a shadow. So you see where I'm getting this bulging out here at the temples. I don't know that I particularly like that, so I'm going to step down a couple subdivision levels and smooth that back. There is a form bulge there where you get the temporalis muscle, but it doesn't peak like that. It's a really unnatural shape that we're getting right there, so I'm going to go in with the move brush. I'm going to try and tweak that back just a little bit. It looks like that might have gotten pulled when I was working on the ear. Now I'm going to go in with the clay tubes brush. I'm going to mask out the temple area on both sides. Invert the mask. And I just want to gently mask out the shape of that muscle that's in there. And just make sure from the front view that it's a gentle sloping curve here and it's not that sudden peak. So now when we step back up our subdivision levels, that form should be corrected. Now I'll go in with the polish brush. Press the B key, P for polish, and I think I will use, there's a lot of options here. I'm just going to use regular polish, which is 0. I'm going to use the polish brush just to break some planes here. I'm just going to do some subtle plane changes. Running into the same problem here at the lower corners of the mouth where it's bulging out a little too much. So I'm just going to polish that back. Again, the polish brush is a lot like flatten mixed with smooth. You have to try it out on your own work to see the forms that it gives you. It's a very interesting brush, very useful for finishing things. Here I'm thinking about these breaks here, and you can see that I've got this shape here. I want to fix that on the opposite side, and this is where working with symmetry turned off can create some extra work for you, where you have to go in and match things. But people have been doing that in clay for thousands of years, and it's not going to hurt us to do it in ZBrush. You could work with symmetry turned on for a longer time. You could get away from this stuff. You could also use Smart Resim. I'm going to go back to the brush menu, P0. You could use Smart Resim to resymmetrize things and then tweak out their symmetry settings, or their symmetry. which I'll actually show you how to do that here in just a moment. Let's see here on this side, I've got that concave form. I'm going to bring that back on this side. Okay, let's go ahead and save our work. Alright, so press the P key to turn off perspective. I'm going to show you how to use Smart Resim to resymmetrize your work. And it's going to be a little dodgy here at the center line because I've actually really broken symmetry here and pushed things around. But it shouldn't be too bad. I'm going to turn off lasso mode. I'm going to lasso out one side with a mask. Now I'm going to go to the deformation menu under Tools. And there's a Smart Resim button here. So before I press that, I'm going to go down to Morph Target, click Store Morph Target, and then I'm going to press Smart Resim. And it's going to analyze the mesh symmetry. It's going to try and copy everything on the masked side over to the unmasked side, so it'll give you a perfectly symmetrical head. And you'll see the difference between the two heads, the symmetrical and the asymmetrical one, when I use the morph target. Because the morph target stores a copy of the mesh as we have it right now. So I can actually switch back and forth between the two just by pressing the switch button. It's also nice to have a morph target stored because it'll allow me to use the morph brush, which allows you to blend between the stored morph target and the current mesh. So that's why if there's a cheekbone that I can't quite match on the other side, if I just symmetrize the mesh like this with a morph target stored, I can just brush in the parts that I want to be symmetrical. So it's going to take it a minute to process this. I'm going to pause it and come back when it's done. So now it's completed its calculations. You can see I'll clear the mask. The head is completely symmetrical now. If I go down to the Morph Target menu and click Switch, you can see the asymmetry that was introduced into the head. So I'll switch back. This is the perfectly symmetrical head. This is the asymmetrical head. I want to bring that cheekbone over, so I'll go to the Morph brush. Morph, there we go. I'll turn up my Z intensity, and I'll just brush into the areas that I want to mirror across. The cheekbone is one, maybe the structure around the eye, and the jawline. Now when I switch, see that we've still got some asymmetry going on. I'm going to go in with the Move brush here and just continue making some asymmetrical changes. But I'm going to try and stay away from the bone structure here of the jawline and the cheekbones. I want to try and keep the asymmetry around the nose and the mouth. I'm going to go up here to the horns. The horns remain symmetrical because of the way we sculpted them. I'm actually going to go in with the Move brush now and make some little tweaks to the shapes, the striations here, because those would definitely not be symmetrical at all. These should have a very chaotic growth pattern to them. Make one of them slightly longer. There we go. I'm actually going to turn on X symmetry here. I'm going to enlarge the eyes just a bit. Now I'm going to select the eyeball geometry, the subtool for the eyeballs themselves. Make sure that our X symmetry is on. And I'm just going to scale the eyeballs up. Go back to the head. Go in with the move brush. Let's bring those lids back over. The upper lid has a tendency to come out further than the lower lid, so I want to try and make sure that that gets into the sculpt here. I'm going to switch to the eyeball, turn off perspective, and I'm just going to pull the eyes forward again. Go back to the head, and with the move brush, shift these around. I'm going to mask out the lower lid. And I want to raise the lower lid, so I'm going to mask out the upper lid now. Just scoot this up, and then pull it out using the move brush. And we'll go in with the inflate brush here, the medial canthus, and let's just try and inflate that little bit of tissue in there. That little pink bit that's inside the tear duct is called the lacrimal carnicle. Just want to inflate that. Let's undo that. Let's hide the eyes. Clear that mask and just make sure we get the right area masked out to do this. I'm going to use the standard brush to pucker the shape around it. Now we'll invert that mask by control-clicking on the background, smooth out that interior, and we'll just try and use the inflate brush to pucker that out. I'm going to step down a subdivision level. Smooth into that again. I think we're going to use a show marquee so we can actually isolate just that area of the eye that we want to work on. There we go. We've got a little bit of a kink in there, a little pinch, which is causing us some problems. So I'm just going to go into the back side with the move brush. I'm just going to manually push this forward. We could push it further forward than it needs to be and then smooth it back. There we go. Now when we smooth it, we'll have more success. Use the inflate brush. Smooth. Now we can turn the eyeball geometry back on and just use the move brush. I'll just pull this and shape it about how I want it. Invert that mask. Let's inflate around this again. Invert the mask again. We'll go into clay tubes. Reveal all, focus, clear the mask. Just use the move brush to do a few little shape tweaks. So here we are. I think that'll do it for tweaking out the eye shapes now. I'm just taking another look around the figure. Smooth back some of this in the back of the head. We're going to move on to detailing later, but I just want to get the form down at this stage. So play with that break there in the back, the neck. Let's mask that back in. Bring the trapezius down and around. There we go. So that completes our tutorial on sculpting a head from a sphere. So remember, this guy is entirely sculpted from a polysphere in ZBrush. So this should help illustrate just how much form you can get from a very simple base mesh. So when we go in and import, a base model of a head, you should be able to get even more form. Or you can just continue to work your own characters using just basic ZBrush primitives. There we go. So for your homework assignment, I want you to go ahead and just take a polysphere, make sure you use the polysphere primitive, not sphere 3D, and sculpt a character head from it. And just use your imagination and try and come up with something interesting. You can also refer to the bonus video from the previous incarnation of this class, where I talk about sculpting a human head from a sphere. We do a skull and then muscles and then flesh on top of that. It's definitely useful information, and I highly recommend watching it. It comes with this class for free. It's another 3 hours of video that I think you will find enlightening, especially because all of the techniques absolutely still apply. I just wanted to re-record this class using some of the newer brushes and some of the newer effects like the depth masking and the polish brushes and things like that. So go ahead and get to it on your own particular head and have fun. And if you have any questions, you can always reach me through the course website. And thank you for watching. We're going to do something really special with the eyeballs. We want to give them both an iris and pupil, as well as create a version with a corneal bulge. And the reason we're doing that is we can use the external eyeball, the one with the corneal bulge, later on if we want to render a specular effect where it looks like you've got the bulge of the lens of the eye, and then we can use the one with the iris and the pupil sculpted in to help us get the correct shadows when we're painting the eye. So the eyeball, just so you know, is not a perfect sphere. There is a bulge where you have the lens on the front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sculpt that one first. I'm going to select these the polysphere subtool. I'm going to divide that a couple times, and I'm going to clone them. And that creates a new version of the polysphere, the eyeball pair there, and I'm going to append them back in. I'm going to rename this one cornea, and I'll rename this one eyeballs. So we'll start with the cornea version. If I have the cornea selected, I'm going to go to the standard brush, and I'm going to change to the drag rectangle stroke, which you'll remember drags out a single instance of the alpha. Now I'm going to select an alpha to be the corneal bulge, and I think alpha 48 looks pretty good for this. Make sure X symmetry is turned on. And let's undo that and turn off the lazy mouse. So you can see when I use the drag rectangle stroke, it just drags a single instance of the alpha, just like that. So if I do that, you can see the effect that it has. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to zoom in, turn up my Z intensity, and I want to drag this corneal bulge so it's just touching the lower eyelid. Hit it with a soft smooth, and there we go. Now we've got just enough geometry poking off the surface so we catch a specular highlight and we catch a shadow on the underside. So that's going to be the corneal bulge eyeball. I'm going to switch to this one, turn off the cornea one. And if you want, you could actually leave the cornea one turned on and turn on transparency so you can see through to the next one. The next one we want to do is we want to actually use the Alt key to press in instead of out, as you can see there. Let's undo that. Make sure our X symmetry is turned on. Turn off perspective. I'm holding down Alt and then just dragging the same stroke. And I'm going to repeat it a couple times there. Turn that off. So now what we've got is a recessed area for the iris, because the iris of the eye is actually recessed into the sphere of the eye. I'm going to go to the standard brush now. Alpha 1. I'm going to use the freehand stroke, and I want to give him a goat iris. So I'm actually going to sculpt this in sideways, just like this. Do a little bit of smoothing there. And we can actually turn off the alpha completely. We don't need that fine of a point there. There we are. Turn off our transparency. Focus back in. So the irises that you see here, we're just going to use as a basis when we go in and sculpt the rest of the head. Or excuse me, when we go in and we paint the rest of the iris. Mainly it's just helpful to get a sense of the gaze of the character. And it's also helpful when you're sculpting the eyelids around it. You can figure out just what the facial expression is going to be based on how much of the iris is showing, where the pupil is placed, all those little nuances. I'm just trying to adjust the eyelid now based on what we've done with the iris. And this is going to be very helpful when we paint this guy in Photoshop, because we'll have shadowing here in the pupil. We'll have a shadow here on the iris. And it's just going to be helpful for us to place where we're going to paint the iris, because we're going to paint the eye pretty much from scratch. Okay. I'm going to knock back the bags into the eyes just a bit. Going in with the clay tubes brush. Just filling in that shadow. And I can turn back on the eyes that don't have the pupil in there, because those sometimes aren't very pleasant to look at, just in terms of they feel a little odd because they haven't been painted. I usually prefer sculpting over eyeballs that just have a corneal bulge sculpted in. It feels more sculptural to me. And I just feel like I can spot it better. And also, if you've got the eyelid coming up and over the cornea, you want to make sure that the eyelid is deformed slightly by that bulge. That's a really important thing to take note of, is that the eyelids are deformed by the surface of the eyeball, and that includes the corneal bulge. I'm going to save our work.